Welcome everyone. I'm Adam Hugg, I'm Director of the Foreign Policy Centre. Just before we get underway, I just want to put on record my thanks to the Aston Centre for Europe for our long-standing relationship over the last couple of years, both back in the before times in person, but more recently over Zoom, to collaborate on bringing together a diverse range of topics for sort of shared audiences of both organisations. Delighted to be able to welcome today's discussion about fostering inclusive growth to level up the UK, the lessons from the Basque Country. Without any further ado, I will hand over to our chair for today's session. That's Dr. Caroline Gray, who is lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. So Caroline, take it away, please. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you all for joining us. So what I'm going to do is give a brief introduction to the topic, and then I'll introduce our speakers, and after that we should have about half an hour for a Q&A. But one thing I want to say before I forget is please do throughout the session put any questions you may have into the Q&A function, and what we'll do is at the end, after each of our speakers has had a chance to present their thoughts, I'll gather together the questions and pose those to our speakers. So first, in terms of a brief introduction to the topic, as we all know, levelling up in the UK has become an important policy agenda for the current government. The term itself, levelling up, is quite vague. There is still a lot of ongoing debate about a concrete definition or a clear strategy, but it's broadly understood that the goals of levelling up should be to improve both economic productivity and standards of living across the country, particularly in areas that lag behind on a range of economic and social indices. And in so doing, the idea is to reduce place-based inequalities. Now, levelling up is a Conservative Party slogan, but the reality is that UK governments of both left and right have been battling for years, for decades rather, with the overarching question of how to address the major, often place-based imbalances in the UK economy and the vastly differing social outcomes that people from different places experience as a result. And in this regard, my personal feeling is that we in the UK still have much to learn from other areas of the world that can serve as models of inclusive growth and development. And so the aim of this panel and this session today is to consider what lessons we might possibly derive from the experience of the Basque Country, a region in northern Spain, and to compare and contrast experiences. So as a heavily industrialised region, the Basque Country was hit very hard by the economic crisis of the 1980s, but since then it's gone on to experience a remarkable economic transformation. And that's a transformation that's noted for its inclusive benefits for the region's overall population. So the Basque region is today among the top regions in Europe, both in terms of GDP per capita and in terms of having a low percentage of population at risk of poverty or social exclusion. And actually, across the political spectrum in the Basque region, achieving economic competitiveness and social inclusion are consistently seen as objectives that go hand in hand. And I'm constantly reminded of this whenever I'm working on the Basque Country. I mean, just last week, for example, I was there and I attended the launch of the 2021 Basque Competitiveness Report by the Basque Institute of Competitiveness. One of our speakers today is from that organisation. And that report is entitled Building Tomorrow's Competitiveness and Wellbeing, i.e. competitiveness and well-being is seen as going hand in hand. So how does the Basque Country achieve this? How has it achieved this? And what can we potentially learn from the Basque example? So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers. So I'll just briefly introduce our speakers. First, we've got four speakers on the panel today. First of all, we're going to hear from Edurne Magro, who's a senior researcher at Orchestra, the Basque Institute for Competitiveness, and a member of the teaching faculty of the University of Deusto in the Basque region. She holds a PhD in business competitiveness and economic development, and she has more than 15 years of experience in coordinating and participating in research projects on competitiveness and innovation at European, Spanish and Basque levels, so supranational, national and regional levels. And she has particular expertise in the fields of territorial strategy and smart specialisation strategies, regional innovation systems, regional innovation policies and their evaluation. Second, we'll hear from Bill Murray, who is an economist specialising in the economy of Spain and its regions. He worked for 30 years until very recently as the British Embassy in Madrid's lead economic attaché, and latterly headed the embassy's economics and public policy team and was awarded an OBE for his services. Since the summer, Bill has moved on to new adventures and is now an advisor covering the Spanish economy and business sectors at Global Council. Afterwards, we'll hear from Igor Calzada, a senior researcher with more than 20 years of experience in digital, urban and political transformations. Since January this year, he's been based at the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data at Cardiff University, where he's involved in important comparative work on the Basque Country and Wales, among other projects. He's also a senior research affiliate at the Urban Transformations and Future of Cities project at the University of Oxford, funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. And he's also served as senior advisor to UN Habitat on digital transformations for urban areas. Previously, something of interest to our discussions today, between 2002 and 2012, he was director in the Basque government, and he worked during that time as well in the flagship industrial Basque hub called Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which is plays a leading role in some of the cooperative economic dynamics in the Basque region. Igor originally did his PhD at Mondragon University and the University of Nevada, looking at city regions from a social innovation perspective, and he's the author of a number of works, including his recent monograph on smart cities citizenship, published by Elsevier. And finally, we'll hear from Henriette Bruckelaar, who will talk to us from a slightly different perspective. Our first three speakers will talk primarily about the Basque case, possible lessons from that, possible comparisons with the UK. And then Henriette will talk primarily from the UK perspective, looking at challenges with the levelling up strategy, given her experience, particularly in the West Midlands. She is Director of Economic Strategy at Greater Birmingham and Solihull Local Enterprise Partnership, and she has extensive practitioner experience in leading economic development and regeneration projects across a range of organisations, including previously Innovation Birmingham and Advantage West Midlands. Henriette started her career in the field of economic generation, broadly understood, in the Netherlands, and since moving to the West Midlands a while back now, she's successfully developed and delivered a wide portfolio of projects, ranging from complex multi-million regeneration programmes to specific startup support projects, among others. She has experience of devising and leading such projects under governments of different political colour in the UK, from the time when regional development agencies were in place under New Labour through to the local enterprise partnerships created subsequently by the Conservatives. And Henriette speaks a number of languages, including Spanish. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Adur now. And just a quick reminder that if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to type them in the Q&A function as they're speaking. I'll gather all those and pose them to our speakers at the end of their interventions, which will be about 10 minutes each from each of them. Thank you very much. Adur, handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thanks for this nice invitation. I'm going to share my screen. And well, hope you can see it. My ideas, the ideas I want to share with you today are based on a series of works that we have done at Orchestra and also in collaboration with some other colleagues. And we have studied and analyzed in the last years the Basque territorial strategy, but focusing on the long term, because for us one of the key issues that I'm going to share with you is that this territorial strategy, the Basque Country strategy, has been a continuous and sustained strategy over the last decades. So mainly the three elements I would like to highlight, or three building blocks that are distinctive of the Basque Country strategy, well, first of all, I think Caroline introduced this very well, is that the strategy has had to mutually reinforced objectives, and these have been competitiveness and well-being that have gone hand in hand. And and we can see this that through the strong industrial policy that has been accompanied by also leveraging other policy areas such as education, health, and social objectives. Another key element is that it's a place-based strategy. We can learn from other territories, but each region, each territory has its own context, and a strategy has to be built around the territorial assets. Of course, taking care of improving weaknesses as well. And as I mentioned before, this strategy has been a long-term strategy since the 80s. And the third element that maybe, well, for me is maybe the most important one is the governance of the strategy. What we see in the Basque case is that governance doesn't depend on the regional government. It depends, or the Basque Country has been able to build a policy community, and we have identified the role of different policy entrepreneurs along the different decades that have promoted the economic development strategy. And this strategy is really based on collaboration and the social capital that has been built in the Basque Country. Well, I'm not gonna stop very much here because Caroline introduced it very well, but the Basque Country has been recognized as a success case in the international sphere. And what we see here is that, well, it has been a very resilient region in economic terms in the different crises, but having a low percentage of population at risk of poverty or social exclusion. It's one of the top regions in Europe in this indicator. So this is, I'm not gonna go through all the elements, but this is how we conceptualize the Basque strategy in the last 12 years. And well, mainly we focus on 3 dimensions. The aim of the strategy, the what for, the what of the strategy, and the who or how of the strategy, the more processual elements. And in the what for, and we conclude that the Basque Country has built a strategy based on innovation and participation, but seeking always inclusive competitiveness. And in the last 12 years, the Basque Country has focused the strategy on some strategic priorities. But these priorities are not new, are built on industrial, scientific, and technological strengths. For example, advanced manufacturing in a traditional industrial region, but also in biosciences and health. And this has been possible because the Basque Country has some assets in terms of STI actors, organizations, infrastructures as well, but also education and skills that have been always aligning within industrial needs, and of course a public sector with capabilities. And another distinctive element of the Basque Country is the variety of factors and public-private initiatives. It's also known as a region that has been pioneer on clusters and cluster policy. And we have large firms that act as promoters of innovation in small and medium-sized companies, and of course a university that really conducts research on industrial needs. But the element that I would like to highlight is the governance. And well, here the Basque Country has been able to build governance with Europe, and internal governance within the Basque government, but with other institutions as well. What we call distributed leadership, because in policy making there is an active participation of industry, university, and knowledge organizations, and different public organizations. And also that the strategy is not static, is that it's based on learning. But of course, we also have challenges, well, as in our as we can see in European trends, international trends, is to integrate and to face the transitions, the demographic transition, energy, environmental, and technological and digital transition, and how the challenge here is to shape the strategy in order, or to orientate the strategy in order to face these challenges. And well, here you have 6 points that we identify, like well, how the strategy has to move forward. Okay, so it's in all the actors, including the public sector innovation. And finally, I would like to highlight these 5 elements that I think are key learnings from the Basque case. First, what I have tried to highlight is that the Basque case has been able to have an orientation that it doesn't exclude social elements, and economic and social elements go together. Also, that we see in the Basque case an example of proactiveness, and especially at the beginning from the public sector, that have taken risk and have tried to make priorities, and to even invest in some capacities that weren't there before, as for example the bioscience sector, but always with a focus of existing strengths. Okay, so the industrial priority has always been there, and this has been always has been a consensus between among all the actors, and that has built policy capabilities that go beyond the powers that the region has, but also with the implication of all of public and private institutions in the strategy. And well, as I mentioned before, the Basque region has really worked on openness on the inside, involving different stakeholders in the strategy, and on the outside by promoting internationalization, but not only of the internationalization of industry, but also of the research and innovation organizations, in education organizations, and so on. So, well, this is my initial remarks, and well, you have at the orchestra webpage, you have several studies that analyze the strategy of the Basque Country.
Thank you very much, Edurne. Bill, would you like to say your words just now? Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just first of all, obviously, to say many thanks to Foreign Policy Centre, to Aston University, and in particular to Caroline for organising really such an interesting and challenging debate today. I have to say, I think Edurne Magro has probably said absolutely everything that I was going to say. So I'll try and pick up on some sort of aspects that she didn't go into, and to leave some areas, obviously, for the question and answer session. Just a very, very quick introductory remarks about the UK's historical relationship, trading relationship with the Basque Country, which actually goes back to 1474, when an agreement was signed, the Guernica Agreement, where, and this was under the times of Edward IV in England, when Basque traders and merchants were guaranteed security, protection of the Crown. At that time, obviously, the Crown of England, before the union of Scotland and England. They were guaranteed the protection of the Crown to go about their business in the UK, in England. And of course, that was reciprocated in the Basque Country, where English merchants were free to trade with the security of a provision of security. So trading relationships between the UK and the Basque Country go back hundreds of years. And last week, in fact, the British Chamber of Commerce in Spain produced its annual barometer of UK investment in Spain. And it, in a very timely fashion, produced a chapter on the Basque Country, which showed that 20% of all foreign direct investment in the Basque Country since the period 2014 until the first half of this year, over 20% of all investment into the Basque Country came from the UK. So I think, that does show the sort of mutual trade and investment flows that exist. We're talking of 2 billion euros in investment. And I think, without going into enormous detail, that compares with example of UK investment in the same period into Catalonia of 2.5 billion. So the Basque Country vying with Catalonia in terms of investment by UK companies. You can imagine where that investment goes. It's going into industry, it's going into telecoms, it's going into the energy. And in certain of those activities, for example, telecoms and energy, UK investment accounts for practically all foreign direct investment into the Basque Country over that period, 2014 until July of this year. So very deep and very important mutual economic ties. So let me just say a bit about my experience of working with the Basque government and Basque companies. And in the embassy, we really have had, over the course of the years, really very intensive relations, not only with the Basque government in Madrid, but also, and this may be a point, a sort of governance institutional point worth taking into account, with the Basque government office here in Madrid, who are tremendously active, explaining what's happening in the Basque Country and inviting other inviting embassies, not only EU embassies, but embassies in Madrid, to sort of hear what's happening in the Basque Country and to learn from their experience. And I have to say that I think when Caroline began her introductory remarks by saying that competitiveness and social conclusion have gone hand in hand in the Basque Country, that very clearly is, I think, one of the hallmarks of Basque economic development. And we, in both the embassy and in our representative office in Bilbao, have really had a lot of contact with the Basque government on a range of policy issues. I have to say more with the Basque government than with any other regional government in Spain. And those initiatives have covered areas like occupational pensions, minimum wages. They've covered areas such as health policy, sustainable development, green economies. And so we really have shared a lot of mutual experiences with the Basque government down through the years. And the Basque government has very strong relationships with, in particular, Wales, it has to be said, but also with Scotland. Now, one aspect which may come out today, I don't want to spend too much time on this, it's a separate seminar on its own, is the very particular system of financing for the Basque Country and for Navarra, its neighbour in the north of Spain. Now, I don't want to go into detail on this. All I want to say is that this agreement has given the Basque government a stable and predictable source of finance. So it really has been possible to engage in that forward-looking type of economic thinking, developing a minimum wage 20 odd years before it existed in Spain, and taking forward a whole series of initiatives on social policy and on inclusion. But that, I think, you know, in terms of a lesson to take away, stable, reliable source of finance is absolutely critical to being able to have a long-term vision. And there's no doubt, as Edurne was saying, that the Basque Country really has, from the very beginning, had this vision of where it wanted to go. Obviously, a model based in industry, obviously a model based in regeneration, with powerful public agencies. The Basque Agency for Reconversion is a real force for change in the Basque Country. And I think, you know, whenever I spoke with both government and companies in the Basque region, I was really struck by this sense of community, this sense that people were in this together, that there was a common goal. And there was, if you like, agreement on how to achieve it. Public-private partnerships, funded initially more by public than by private money. But as I say, a model which really brought in all aspects, all different elements of Basque society, universities, very important. And so I think that common goal, that common purpose has really been very important in explaining some of the Basque Country successes. And I was always struck in the Basque Country when you asked Basque, especially people in the Basque government, to explain their benchmarks, who they were really trying to emulate. It was always Germany. And I don't think I've really heard this in any other region in Europe. It was always Germany. Logically, there are industrial similarities there, but it showed, I think, just the ambitions and setting the bar very high. And the recently produced European Regional Competitiveness Index, which came out very recently, has a very, I'm not going to go into detail, very interesting scoreboard. And there, I think you can see that Madrid and the Basque Country really do score above any other Spanish region. So there's a lot more I could say. I'll just finish, I think, with two comments. One is the fact that the Basque Country has both a bilateral and, in a Spanish regional sense, a multilateral relationship with the centre, with the government in Madrid. As I say, it's both bilateral. Some things that are sector level agreements where they get together with the government in Madrid, but there are also other areas where they negotiate with the other regions in Spain. I know the Basque Country won't like me classifying them as a region here, but I think, you know, that's an important factor that really, in part, explains how the Basque government has been able to get its views across in Madrid. And I think that the second point, and maybe this is one more for the debate, is that the Basque Country is now facing a problem of integration of its immigrant community. And this is an issue which has appeared in recent years. Some of the statistics really are very alarming in terms of social exclusion of that group. And it's something I know the Basque government is really focused on and on top of, and the various inclusion policies they've got, they'll bring to bear. But this is a new challenge, or a bigger challenge than it was in recent years. As I say, I could go on, but I'll finish there and leave stuff for the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Bill. Igor, would you like to take over now? Thank you.
Yes. Could you see the screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And first and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers, Aston Centre for Europe, and the Foreign Policy Center, and particularly Dr. Caroline Gray, for inviting me to contribute to this event and to share my views with all of you. Actually, I should confess that I'm excited about this opportunity to build bridges between here, where I am at the moment, this picture, Wales in the UK, my home country, the Basque Country. So just in a nutshell, because I don't want it to go in detail, has been very well introduced by the moderator, by Dr. Caroline Gray. But just in a nutshell, I have spent the last decade in the UK, mostly in Oxford, the University of Oxford, and at the moment in Worcester, at Cardiff University. Before that, in the meantime, I need to say also that I was a lecturer at Aston University, so it's good to be also invited by Aston University. And in the decade before, as it was said before, I almost for a decade, for 10 years, I worked at the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Also, I was director at the Basque government, and I was Iker Basque Fellow when I joined Oxford. So for me too, bridging has been part of my scholarly engaged activities, and supported by the Memorandum of Understanding between the Basque and the Welsh government from Wizard. Recently, we have kicked off a preliminary university and industry cooperation with for GUNE. And in the past as well, just during the period 2016-2018, I was also involved in partnering the University of Oxford and the Free University. So what I would like to focus my talk is two main facts. I'm going to focus on my work from Wales, from here. So two main facts: the existence of the Memorandum of Understanding between the Basque and the Welsh government. And the second fact, that is the existence of a mutual recognition in both nations as a highly priority targeted territories. So, and because my position, I wanted to be, I feel that I'm in a bridge, I'm in the middle. So I prefer to replace the word lessons with learnings, because I think that patronizing, I think, is not a good way to do it. So, and another etymological caveat that I would like to make before starting, I'm going to refer to the Basque autonomous community rather than the Basque Country in itself, because the Basque Country, as you can see in the slide, has been deeply researched and even published in several papers and even books. And I think that the Basque Country is a complex entity, a complex city regional entity. So onwards, where I'm going to refer to the Basque Country as the Basque Autonomous Community. So having made this clarification, my take and my perspective on this is that the Basque Autonomous Community actually is one of the few regions in the world that can lay claim to having proactively and consistently built a successful industry-focused territorial strategy over the course of several decades. Particularly over the last 20 years, the Basque Autonomous Community has built a sustained resilience and successfully navigated the financial crisis. So there are several learnings they have already mentioned. So I'm going to, let's say, emphasize them. The tax policy autonomy is very clear that the Basque Autonomous Community, alongside Navarra, the statutory community of Navarra, I think that is a good distinction made by Bill Murray before, enjoys a greater policy autonomy than any other subnational city region in Europe. The second point, a multi-level governance model encompasses, again, complex policy-making levels, which requires considerable coordination and has necessitated innovative governance solutions that are not without problems. So I think something that maybe we can start connecting with the whole debate of leveling up. The third one is the policy has been instrumental in driving primarily an industrial transformation of the economy. So maybe we can learn on that, but probably we should learn from other places about another kind of policies as well. And the fourth one is the pioneers of cluster policies in the 1990s. A culture of a strong public-private partnership, as already mentioned, was fostered to address a specific of weakness and also to build on the strengths. So in my opinion, probably, however, the first learning from my perspective is rather obvious, that the Basque Autonomous Community's governance model has been largely based on the public-public and on the public-private partnership. So consequently, triple helix has been very much the broadly used governance framework so far. Given new insights on territorial strategic modeling in smart cities and smart regions, as depicted through my new book entitled The Smart City Citizenship, I argue, and this is my key message, that we should complement probably also this cycle, moving towards social innovation, sometimes slightly mentioned, with a highly assessed policy framework called pentahelix, even overcoming the so-called quadruple helix. Pentahelix include not only the private, the public, and the academia, unlike the triple helix, but also civil society and a wide range of active entrepreneurs, activists, assemblers, and brokers that act as territorial ecosystems activators. So in my book, for instance, I illustrate this framework by using different cases in cities, including not only San Sebastian, Bilbao, Vitoria-Gasteiz, or even Pamplona, Iruña, Pamplona, in the Basque Autonomous Community and Statutory Community of Navarre, respectively, but also Bristol and in England and Glasgow in Scotland in the UK. I think that there are cities that probably they are leveling up the whole socioeconomic development. The second learning probably is that it's not just a case of having policy autonomy at a regional level, but also of how this policy is coordinated, very much the connection with the whole debate of leveling up. And the third one, consequently, the third learning is that inclusive growth is understood generally, and I'm going to open up here the scope in the Basque Country as a whole, including considering the three administrative entities associated intrinsically with social inclusiveness and very much related to an ethos of community-driven bottom-up development tradition called Auzolan. Very much related, we can talk about this in Navarra, we can talk about the Basque Autonomous Community, but also in the French Basque Country. I think it's something that is very much in the ethos of the socioeconomic models. My key message here in relation with the Basque Country and Basque Autonomous Community and Wales is that despite the fact that the Basque Autonomous Community has achieved to blend successfully policy instruments around industrial policy and strategies by focusing on new economic sectors and adapting them quickly, a common ground for mutual learning based on the ongoing Wales and Basque Country cooperation is possible to be built for leveling up based on two main pillars. The first one is something that is in the slide, putting foundational and economic principles at the center of our policies, both in the Basque Autonomous Communities, in Wales, but overall in the UK. I think that this is even could be broader. And the second one is investing in transdisciplinary social sciences. As a result of our ongoing cooperation and responding to the question, what can a peripheral and a small nation like Wales learn from another peripheral and a small nation like the Basque Country and vice versa, I would suggest two initiatives in a very humble manner. From the perspective of the digital foundational economy, I think that the Wales Data Nation Accelerator is a very interesting project. And from the transdisciplinary applied social sciences, I should mention Spark, which is the new social science research park that is at the moment building here in Cardiff. So to sum up, I believe that there is a growing potential in Wales and in the Basque Country, once again, as a whole entity with the three entities, to and probably in other regions around the UK and also in Spain, to collaborate in the field of the urban regional development through inclusive growth. From Wizard, from Cardiff University, we are shedding light on this mutual strategic pathway through several timely and recent publications on digital foundational economy, referring to data sovereignty, data cooperatives, with a strong cooperative tradition that is in the Basque Country, and digital rights in collaboration with the Platform Cooperativism Consortium, with the United Nations, and also the Coalition of Cities for Digital Rights. So in summary, I can see highly complementary research and policy agendas in terms of inclusive socioeconomical development among the Basque Autonomous Community and Wales. Wales contributing with the foundational and economic principles and initiatives, ongoing initiatives, and strong capabilities in transdisciplinary social science, whereas the Basque Autonomous Community with a solid industrial policy, probably with many learnings from the multi-level governance perspective. Thank you very much. I'm happy to contribute to the debate later on.
Thank you very much, Igor. And Henriette, would you like to take over now?
I will. Thank you, Caroline. I'm on two devices and I'm going to try and share my screen if I can. So can you see that? And if so, is that visible? Brilliant.
Yes.
Now, to start off, as you rightly introduced me, I'm a practitioner, and I've been fascinated by the presentation so far, and I feel quite lucky that I'm the last one in the list, and there's quite a few points of common ground I can see between the Greater Birmingham City region and the Basque Country. As Caroline said, I'm Director of Economic Strategy at the Greater Birmingham and Solihull Local Enterprise Partnership. And I'm really coming at it from a levelling up from a very local perspective, and also a levelling up at a local perspective before we know quite what the UK government means by levelling up, because of course the white paper hasn't been published quite yet. Just an introduction to Greater Birmingham and Solihull City region. For those of you who don't know, it's the area that you can see on the UK map. It's an area that comprises of 9 local authorities, but of course Birmingham is the biggest urban conurbation within it. Combined population of over 2 million, with Birmingham making up almost 1.2 million of those. an economy worth almost £55 billion, which is around 64 billion euros, employing 1.1 million. Birmingham as a city is the UK's second city with a really young population, an average age of 33, and 46% of the population is under the age of 30, and a really diverse city as well, with a majority from a non-white background, hosting residents from 186 nationalities, and 1 in 4 people in Birmingham are born outside of the UK, and I am one of them. And that does, of course, affect the culture and the identity of the city region. The local enterprise partnership where I work is one of 38 set up by UK government some 10 years ago, and they were put in place to drive sustainable and inclusive economic growth, entrusted with public funding to do so. And we've talked about the triple helix, and talking to and listening to Igor, we might well have to add a few circles to that triple helix, but it's very much led by the business community, and 99.8% of our businesses in our city region are small and medium-sized businesses, and particularly small ones. And I think there are some real challenges in terms of making our triple helix work. And I thought some of the things Bill said about stable and predictable income streams in particular are really important, because what we do find is that there's quite short funding cycles and quite competitive funding cycles, which don't always make the longer term planning and robust partnerships that easy. I also thought was really interesting that Edurne referred to clusters and the track record that the Basque Country has in terms of clusters. I was involved in West Midlands cluster in the Greater Birmingham region's cluster policy in the 90s. They then went away, clusters went away. We talked about sectors again, and they just seem to have come back on the scene. So these things do kind of come and go. In terms of the Greater Birmingham area before COVID, there were some real strengths that meant we grew at a very fast pace. We had a high overall economic growth rate, very great, very good track record on foreign direct investment, highest levels outside of London, lots of jobs growth in areas like professional, digital, technical, real vibrant growing visitor economy based in to quite a large extent on retail as well, a real healthy innovation ecosystem, strong university presence. There are 5 universities in Birmingham, and of course Aston is a very is a real great one in there, and the highest level of life satisfaction of all UK core cities. Weaknesses were really around, although there was very strong growth, the productivity per head did underperform compared to the national average, below average employment rate and above average unemployment rate. And also there was a real skills gap, particularly in higher level qualifications, where we weren't performing as well as UK average. But overall, growth was the buzzword in Birmingham, and a recognition that there was a gap with UK average, but we were rapidly closing that gap. And then, of course, COVID hit, and we've got a young and diverse population. We've got a lot of manufacturing, hospitality, and retail sectors that were disproportionately affected, communities that were disproportionately affected, high infection rates, lots of businesses that had to close temporarily or more longer term. So lots of people that were either made redundant or put onto the furlough scheme. So a real significant impact on the Birmingham and wider economy. And that then meant that right now, in terms of the aftermath of COVID, and I'm hoping I'm not overly optimistic when I refer to aftermath, but let's call it that for now, things do look quite a bit different. And particularly, obviously, GVA and economic growth, economic output fell significantly, more so than in other parts of the UK or Europe. High unemployment and really high youth unemployment in particular at around 14%, and that's slow to reduce. Real supply chain issues, which aren't just about COVID, but also around Brexit. Some sectors particularly badly affected, export and impact and import affected, but some underlying strengths that haven't changed. The strength about having those 5 universities, the strength about, that comes from being so centrally located. 90% of the UK population can be reached within 4 hours from Birmingham. But what did happen during COVID is that we went from the happiest, highest scorer on life satisfaction to now the bottom scorer. So that's really indicative of the impact it's had. And also the inequalities that already existed in Birmingham have been exacerbated. Birmingham's the 3rd most deprived core city. Around 40% of children in Birmingham live in relative poverty. That's a real urgent pressing issue. That's about families having to choose between heating and food. That's about families not being able to afford the transport costs to take children to school. Those types of choices affect 40% of children. 90% of neighbourhoods wards in Birmingham are more deprived than the UK average, and there is a staggering 10-year gap in life expectancy between the poorest areas. So it's really clear that levelling up in Greater Birmingham is really, really important and really topical. And that there's a massive need for levelling up in the city and the city region to make sure that those place-based inequalities and community-based inequalities are addressed. And that is in line with UK government's agenda, although we can't afford to wait for the UK government's agenda to be published, and actually a policy has been developed, and that was recently launched by Birmingham City Council in particular, looking at, and I think it was Edurne or certainly one of the previous speakers who mentioned the really importance between sustainable economic growth and longer, happier, healthier lives for all. So those are 2 overarching aims, if you like, and underneath them sit pillars that need to be addressed in order to achieve that levelling up agenda. And I'll kind of briefly run through each of them. There's the pillar around education and making sure that more children and young people in the area attend good or outstanding schools, and more of them progress on to higher or further education and training. And at the moment, as I said, there's still a gap there. There's also a gap in terms of STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths subjects, which are, of course, really essential for many jobs in technology and digital sciences in particular. There's an emphasis on skills, and that's also around making sure that people who are already in employment get the skills that make sure they can progress. It's also about language skills, making sure that those who live in our city for whom English isn't their first language actually have the opportunity to learn sufficient English to be productive in the labour market. And it's about lifelong skills. There's a real emphasis on jobs and making sure the job opportunities that are there, and like many other parts of Europe and the UK, we've got real significant labour market shortages at the moment with very high levels of unfilled vacancies. And as the economy is is opening up again post-lockdown, we're finding that there's more vacancies than individuals to fill those vacancies. And we also find very often people who access those job opportunities are not from the local area. So we need to increase that take up from local residents into those good quality jobs. There's housing. One of you mentioned it already, that housing is so fundamental to people's health, both physical and mental health, to productivity, to educational attainment. We've got a really large old housing stock which performs poorly, and including in terms of energy performance. So it's a real priority to address that and to start with social housing and affordable housing in particular. Really important that the local community has a say in public services, be they library services, care services, park services, and so on, and that involvement reflects the diversity and the age profile of the city, and that's a real challenge for the city at the moment. In terms of living environment, making sure that more people have access to environments that are green, that there's clean air. Birmingham's just introduced a clean air zone in the city, that there are environments where active travel, walking, cycling, and so on can take place in safety, where there's scope for communities to come together, and where people can thrive, including and without necessarily having to spend large amounts of money as well. So where people can thrive regardless of their disposable income. And finally, it's about infrastructure and connectivity. We know that it's extremely difficult for many people to access education, skills, or work, because it's very difficult for them to afford and access transport. So there are many parts of our city that aren't well served by public transport. There are many people who rely on public transport, so it's a priority to improve that. We have, many of you will know, we have got the HS2 coming to Birmingham. So from 2029, the journey to London will be reduced significantly to only about 50 minutes. We're going to be really accessible in terms of access to other parts of the country, but we need to make sure that our communities can access each other really easily. And then finally, I would say what our levelling up agenda really relies on as well as ambition and aspiration. Things like HS2, things like high levels of inward investment are key, but also next year we're hosting the Commonwealth Games, which could be a really critical opportunity for local people and local young people in particular to raise their aspirations and take pride in where they live. And that's fundamental to people being able to imagine their own ambitious future as well. And that's what I wanted to say about levelling up in Birmingham, Caroline.
Well, thank you very much. That was, and thank you, Henriette, and thank you to all our panelists. I think that we had some great insights there into today's topic, and we've got a number of questions in the chat. So I think we'll get started with some of those. I'll try and join some of them together where there's someone on similar issues. So I think if we first go back to the Basque case, I mean, one of the issues that Bill mentioned and that came up in Igor's comments as well is the question of the fact that the Basque Country does have a high degree of fiscal autonomy, or the Basque autonomous community, I should say, as Igor so rightly pointed out, does have a high degree of fiscal autonomy. So we have a question in the chat as to what extent the success of the Basque Country depends on its high degree of fiscal autonomy. And another question which is related to that is, we have another question pointing out that it seems that autonomous governance is key to success, and therefore does that mean that the Basque experience can only really be extrapolated or be applicable to, say, Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, or is it something that we can extract lessons for the poorer areas of England as well? So perhaps who would like to start on that? I don't know, Bill, would you like to give some comments first on that subject, since you mentioned that in your comments?
Surely, a nice easy one. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I think the as I was saying before, to go into we don't have time to go into detail on this, but the Basque Country and Navarra really do have unique tax gathering powers. And I think this is really important because, in fact, it's the Diputación, it's the county level. There are 3 counties within the Basque Country, for those who don't know its structure. And it's the Diputación of the county who actually raised the taxes. So within the Basque Country, there is a very complex governance model that, you know, can cause frictions. There can be tensions. But I think that's an example really of fiscal federalism in action. And I don't think there's any doubt we're talking about a very effective tax raising system. And I think it has throughout the years consistently. That, together with the constitutional settlement, which respects traditional Basque and Navarran rights, has given the Basque Country, you know, really quite a generous financial settlement. And I think that partly sort of goes to answering Martin's question. How is it possible to have this level of social inclusion when your labour force participation is below the EU average, and productivity, frankly, isn't that far above the Spanish average, even given the fact we're talking about an industrial society, and industry does tend to have higher levels of productivity. So I think, you know, there is a lesson there. The Basque Country, clearly 2 million odd people. Population, interestingly, hasn't really changed in the last 20 years. So I think, you know, the Basque model is a contributing factor. The financing model is a contributory factor, but by no means the only one. I think, you know, just to pick up on other people were saying briefly, you know, the Basque Country was talking about clusters. Michael Porter was obviously involved in the development of clusters in the Basque Country, you know, and he, you know, he spent a long time in the Basque Country. The Basque Country was talking about clusters long before any other region in Spain. And, you know, I think Igor's point about the long tradition of cooperatives, Mondragon, is obviously the sort of classic example of that. You know, there is this mixture of top-down and bottom-up factors that, you know, disaggregating them is really quite difficult. And it's obviously, you know, it's obviously difficult to export one model to others. But I completely buy the logic of this, this seminar. You know, whether it's lessons, takeaways, whatever you want to call them. And I think there are things that can be learned from the Basque experience.
Thank you very much. Igor or Edurne, would you like to add anything to that on that topic?
Well, I think, well, I really agree with Bill's view on this. I think of, well, fiscal autonomy, of course, is one element that really contributed to the success of the Basque strategy. But I think it's more, it's a combination of elements, and sometimes it's not only a question of resources or a question of power, it's a question of capabilities. And there are many, I'm not talking only about regions, there are many territories that have powers and are not able to build such a successful strategy. And I think Bill's in his introduction also highlighted that element of improving or ambition that the Basque Country has always had, and it's not because of being successful the Basque Country has stopped looking at his weaknesses. Okay, so it's not a question of funds or of fiscal autonomy, it's how you use them. Okay, so I think it's well, a more complex picture.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think we can move on to some of the other questions. Actually, interestingly, we had another question in the chat looking at how, given the amount of influence that local government has in the Basque case, what happens therefore in the UK? And one of the questions was, given party politics, how much influence does local government have on Westminster to deal with these issues in the poorer areas? The Basque Country has a government, an ability to affect fiscal policy, whereas in the UK, obviously, your local authorities and your regions don't have that level of power. So Henriette's answered that question in the chat, but I just wondered, Henriette, actually, if you'd like to touch on that here, because obviously one of the big differences we have between the Basque region and the local authorities and regions in the UK is that none of the local authorities and regions in the UK do have the level of autonomy in terms of decision-making power. And certainly for now, I mean, you talked, Henriette, in your conversation about the fact that we are still waiting for details about the levelling up strategy, and that makes it very difficult for the local authorities and the regions in the UK to actually make decisions. So would you like to make some comments on that effect? Because I think it's really a key difference that is important.
Yeah, it's a real key point, I think, because long-term planning is very difficult, and true partnership approach is definitely more challenging if you know you are competing with each other for revolving funding rounds that so quickly as every 12 months. So there's definitely a need for a more longer term single pot of resources, and whether that is devolved from Westminster to combined authority areas, and of course we are part of a combined authority area as well, which is the West Midlands, or whether it goes to county level or local authority level, or indeed local enterprise partnership level. But some longer term single pot funding, I think, is really important. And I want to think that this isn't about party politics. So this is too important to be about party politics, but definitely from my experience, and I used to work for a regional development agency and then did different things with my life and have recently come back into this landscape, I think it has become more fragmented, and with public funding being really tight and limited, it's even more important that we are able to use it wisely and have a longer time horizon.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, actually, Henriette, another question which you might be able to help us with in the chat from Georgina Blakely. Given the focus on the importance of industrial strategy in the Basque Country, was it, by comparison, a mistake for the Johnson government to ditch the local industrial strategies of the previous May government? What's been your experience from your role of the changes in those industrial strategies?
Well, I think the local industrial strategies haven't quite been officially ditched because there's nothing to replace them yet. So I definitely think we don't consider them ditched yet, but I do understand the question. And I think it is really important that we move and can constantly evolve, but it does help if there's an alternative agenda. And of course there is the plan for growth, but that as yet hasn't got a subnational equivalent. So from our perspective, we do still look at the industrial strategy, and as and when there is a regional plan for growth, it will evolve from the industrial strategy. So it'll be evolution, not revolution, because there's so much that's learned, and there's so much resource involved with reinventing wheels that don't need reinventing.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the chat on the issue of political violence in the Basque Country and how that's affected matters. Igor, I wonder if you could help us with those. So from Mark English, we had a question about, has the need to be on guard against a resurgence of conflict in the Basque Country actually made it easier to get public investment and political buy-in for an inclusive growth strategy, given that it is levelling up?
I think it's a very interesting question, because nobody mentioned that. Even I try to avoid that, but I think it goes hand in hand with the fiscal autonomy. Fiscal autonomy has been the trigger for many policy actively, but the violence, the political violence has been there. So it has been, the Basque Country as a whole has been very resilient, let's say actively very resilient region. And it's why I didn't mention something in the previous question, because I wanted to be quiet, but I think that this is exactly the connection. I think that the fiscal autonomy, of course, is important, but the whole top-down conscious policy and the unconscious bottom-up, Mondragon has not created by chance. It has been in a valley, it has been a network of small SMEs. And so I think the combination of the conscious top-down and the unconscious bottom-up grassroots movement has created what we have at the moment. But probably, I think the first one was very, as all the speakers, we all agreed in the same point. It was very conscious kind of policy making, whereas the second one was very unconscious, and probably because this kind of context was, very, let's say, very violent context in which people try to survive. At the end of the day, we try to survive with the conflict. Every day we were in danger. We had some kind of threats around our lives. But I think we cannot understand. It's why I think that the connection with the Northern Ireland, we are writing a paper at the moment exactly connecting these two resilient processes. Both of them are post-conflict areas. Of course, there are quite a lot of differences, but we can see the connection of, let's say, the devolution and how resilient could work in order to create an economic and social development, I would say.
Thank you very much. And yes, that relates to another question we had from David Matheson about how is it possible to root an economy based on cohesion, partnership and inclusion during a period when Basque institutions were characterized by deep division. But really, you've answered that at the same time, yes, because it is those bottom-up dynamics. So, okay, so in discussing the Basque case, obviously presenting it as a model example, we have come across some issues that not everything is rosy. We have one question in the Q&A about unemployment for young people. Edurne, it's a question about is unemployment for under 25s is one of the commentators is asking, I believe unemployment for under 25s is still over 30%. What measures are underway to deal with this? Could you perhaps talk to us a bit about youth unemployment in the Basque Country and how that compares with Spain and wider Europe?
Okay, I think it's an interesting question because, despite the vast success, we have these unemployment rates. But it's an interesting question because what is happening now in the Basque region is that we lack some specific profiles. So what the government, and this is what, for example, comes from cluster associations, that there are some profiles that can't be found in the Basque Country. So it's a bit, a paradox. So we have that youth unemployment, and then we lack people in certain occupations. So what the Basque government is trying, has already done, but is really focusing is on readjusting that supply-demand issue. So I didn't mention, but for example, in the Basque region, the vocational training centers really have played a very, very key role in economic development by listening to the industrial needs and trying to adjust the skills to that needs. So I think the path is that. And I don't think it's only a question of the Basque region, because I think it's also there are some profiles like linked to artificial intelligence that are lacking in many, many territories.
And I think, you know, just elaborating on various issues. I mean, Bill, you mentioned during your presentation about the issue of immigration into the Basque Country, that's one of the challenges they now need to deal with. My understanding from reading reports is that an aging population, I mean, obviously an aging population is a problem overall, but it's for the Basque Country a particularly acute problem coming. I don't know, Edurne, would you like to comment a bit on some of these challenges as well that the Basque Country is facing?
Yeah, I think we rank. It's one of the biggest challenges in terms of aging, and but I also have to say that one of the weaknesses of the Basque Country, I think it's related to other question that is there as well, is that well, it has built an internal cohesion, and one of the weaknesses over years have been the lack of connection, international connection, but the strategy really has focused in the last decade on improving that, and I think is not well, the answer. I don't have the answer to this socio-demographic problem or challenge, but I think it's a combination of attracting people. So you have to really maintain the territory attractive for people to come, and especially we will have a problem in some occupations that people that are very related to care and to foundational economy, that we will need people from that are prepared and want to do that type of job. And I think one of the I mean, all the social policy again has to be linked with the economic development policy, and in terms of life balance, gender policy, fostering well, natality, birth. So I think it's a very complex issue.
Definitely, thank you. Okay, so Henriette, a question for you. You were mentioning during your presentation, obviously, that levelling up involves a huge range of areas. It's not just economic productivity. There's the broader social, a whole range of measures and a whole range of factors like education and health that need to be taken into account. We do have a question in the chat about issues to do with housing and medical treatment, how what access to housing is going to be facilitated for those who can't buy medical treatment. How could the UK level up for the future? I don't know if you want to make any comments on issues in relation to housing, medical access, and the challenges in that regard.
Well, of course, medical treatment is more an NHS responsibility, and that just sit a little bit separately. But of course, health is much more than medical treatment, and in fact, building healthy communities is around education. It's around access to affordable foods that support a healthy diet, which then helps combat things like obesity and diabetes and so on. It's about healthy homes. So there's lots that can be done outside of the NHS, and a health system that, of course, right now is under tremendous pressure, and a mental health system that's under tremendous pressure. In terms of housing, one of the things that can be done at more local level, and it's not so much the local enterprise partnership. We did used to manage capital programs that included unlocking housing sites, but what local authorities, of course, can do is look at housing, sheltered accommodation for people who are at risk of homelessness, and that's certainly something that's a growing problem in the Birmingham area. But it's also the affordable housing and making sure that housing stock, which is aimed at people who can't afford to buy a property, and who will rent a property, is actually kept up to a quality standard that's sufficient. So that those are the kind of decisions that are taken locally. They still rely on funding that does come down from Westminster.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I think we've answered most of the questions in the Q&A function, and I think, you know, thinking about all the presentations we've heard and comments that all our panelists have made, I think a recurring theme that has come up has been the question of the extent to which partnerships, public-public and public-private partnerships contribute to levelling up or social inclusiveness in economic development, both in the Basque case and in the UK case. The extent to which these partnerships work between different levels of government, between government and private organisations, really plays a crucial role in delivering on inclusive economic growth. And I just wondered, since we've got about 10 minutes or so left, if perhaps each of our speakers could give one example that they think has been key, either as a success or as a problem, in terms of these relationships and how they've contributed to inclusive economic growth, either achieving that or obstacles to that. Would that be feasible if we could perhaps have a comment from each of our panelists on that subject? Because I do think it's a recurring theme that and certainly when I've been in the Basque Country doing interviews, one of the things that always comes up is that the collaboration between different levels of government and between public and private actors has been absolutely crucial to achieving inclusive economic development. And that is something that can be extracted to different contexts. Even if you have got different levels of fiscal autonomy, you have got different levels of political devolution, those kind of partnerships are necessary in all contexts. So perhaps we could have a comment from each of our panelists on you know, these kind of partnerships, what does work, what doesn't. Could I perhaps ask if Henriette, since you're there, if you might mind going first?
Yes, I'm going to say the local economic, the local enterprise partnerships are a real success factor in the UK context, because they do bring together that triple helix, which may need to grow, but the importance of bringing business around the same table with academia, higher and further education, and with local government has proven to be really important and effective. And I think that's also proven to be a really sensible way of governing investments, including capital investments, because it does mean that you get different perspectives. You get that all important business perspective, but also the political and the academic to drive your investment decisions. And it's not a given in the UK that we will continue to have these partnerships in place, and yet I really believe it's critically important that we protect that diversity of opinion around one table. And I also think that's the most effective way of avoiding competition between different players, which then means silo working and achieving the opposite of a whole that's worth more than a sum of the parts.
Thank you very much. Bill?
Before I try to answer that question, Caroline, I'd just like to highlight one thing I think we should bear in mind in the sort of very recent historical past of the Basque Country. And that's the fact that the Basque Country, like Spain, suffered two very positive shocks when Spain joined the European Economic Community in 1986, and monetary union when Spain joined the euro, when the Bank of Spain very skillfully engineered really quite a competitive exchange rate from the old peseta to the euro, which obviously helped an industrial, an economy based in industry. So I think when we're looking at the Basque Country's recent past, we really have to bear in mind there's two very positive shocks in there. I mean, I'm no expert on the sort of micro aspects of the Basque economy, but certainly the technology centres are something that everyone talks about. And I think, you know, they were primarily kicked off with public investment. They've led to all sorts of spin-offs, because the Basque Country does have a very complex sort of business environment. I mean, I mentioned before the recent European Commission Regional Competitiveness Index. Now, interestingly, the Basque Country scores badly for what's called business sophistication in that index. And, you know, I think, you know, there are lots of in common with the rest of Spain. It's an economy of SMEs, but there's also a history of large industrial Basque families owning companies. And I think the relationships with government there have been complex, but there's no doubt that the Basque government has been instrumental in sort of really kicking some of these older institutions into the 21st century. And as I say, I really don't know the ins of these technology sectors, but you speak to anyone in Bilbao, Vitoria, and that's what, you know, they'll tout.
Thank you very much. Edurne, would you like to give us an example of what I was mentioning before, an example of what you consider to be a particularly important partnership in the Basque case, but feel free as well to add any other closing comments you'd like to.
I think there are many examples, and I think it's one of the elements we can highlight is that we have what we call orchestra intermediaries. But for example, I think I mentioned before vocational training centers. Bill has mentioned now technology centers, that they are also part of a network that has been built over the last decades. We mentioned cluster associations, and we didn't mention, I think, another actor that is really is a key actor for giving capillarity to the strategy for the local level, and these are local development agencies. So we have and local development agencies really worked together with industry and with also the provincial council levels. And so this multi-level governance is really integrated. And I think also maybe it's not, I think one of the elements that it's not because of policy but it's a contextual element that I think it helped a lot to the Basque development is the geography. We are 2 million inhabitants, but geography is has been a conditionant of development within counties, within valleys. We know, I mean, people, if you analyze the history of the policy development, you see that people that have been in the government then have moved to industry and have acted as entrepreneurs in both sides, in both places. So there are contextual elements that have shaped a strategy, and I think that's why it's we can learn from the Basque strategy, but we have to have our own place-based strategies.
Thank you very much. And Igor?
Yeah, for me, my final remark is very clear, and it's very clear, too much for me. I don't know for the rest. And it's that we are taking for granted public-private partnership and public-public partnership as the only way to leveling up or to contribute to inclusive growth. And I think it's in the post-pandemics, I think it's not enough. Talking about social care and social policy, I think it's not enough. Nobody mentioned digitalization. Nobody mentioned datafication. And I think that at the moment, in addition to public authorities and private actors, we have a civil society suffering a post-pandemics, but at the same time not reacting resiliently to these pandemics. So I think that is why when we are thinking about how can we imagine, we have many examples in the Basque Country as a whole, but also in the UK, how people are reacting. I think that we need to include this in the leveling up strategy. So it's why, again, of course, we have very good examples, but they are not put in the surface. The case of Mondragon is always the case, and I'm very happy because I'm proud to be working on that. But we need to imagine and we need to give voice to some actors that they are not in the decision-making processes. And at the moment, I think it's crucial. Therefore, I would suggest that we need to open up the scope of including more actors. Otherwise, I think it's not enough thinking at the moment in the public-private partnership or in the public-public partnership. I think we need to be much more self-demanding, I would say.
Well, thank you very much. That gives us plenty more for a future discussion on that topic then. Well, I'd like to say thank you to the panelists or to all of you for contributing today. It's really been a really interesting discussion, and I'm very grateful to you all for your time and your insights. I'd also like to thank the attendees who joined us for this evening, and I'd like to thank the Foreign Policy Centre, particularly Adam and Poppy, who were involved in helping with the organisation for this, and who are always on board with our joint series of seminars between the Aston Centre for Europe and the Foreign Policy Centre. So thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening, what's left of it. Thank you all.